Hello and welcome to The Urbanist, Monocle's program all about the built environment. I'm your host, Carlotta Rebello. Coming up,
you can unlock another level of the city experience and even hear some unexpected Tokyo features like the ocean waves, the hum of birds and insects, or trees rustling their branches in the wind.
we visit two top destinations you may want to put in your travel plans for the year ahead. From a Portuguese region where the hospitality sector is aiming to respond to a recent boom in visitor numbers, to the Japanese capital where the urban soundscape can be just as attractive as the usual tourist draw cards. That's all ahead in the next 30 minutes right here on The Urbanist with me, Carlotta Rebello. We start today in Portugal, which saw a record level of visitor numbers in the past year. It would have been difficult to predict that a golden era of Portuguese hospitality would take place just over a decade after the European debt crisis and the Troika bailout program, which helped turn the country's coffers around. One of the most popular destinations in the country is the Algarve, the region which stretches across mainland Portugal's southern coast. But with record number of visitors drawn to towns like Lagos or the region's capital Faro, comes the need for more of just about everything, especially places to stay. The global urbanism practice Broadway Malian has been working on 2 new hotels in Lagos recently, among many others across the whole of the country. To find out more, I'm joined now by Margarida Caldeira, the head of Broadway Malian's Lisbon studio and of hospitality for the practice as a whole. Margarida, thank you for joining me. Can we start with the big picture for Portugal? How has the hospitality industry been doing?
The hospitality industry in Portugal has been doing extremely well. Numbers never have been so high in every aspect. We have increasing number of visitors. We have increasing number of new hotels. I think our hospitality industry all over the years have been well positioned to welcome people, and hospitality is very much related with experience. That's something that Portugal all over these years has been offered to the world in a way. And that's why, for instance, last year I was here that the 2 countries in the world that have been increasing number of visitors in terms of tourism has been Japan and Portugal. So in a way, how could we be on this position maybe 10 years ago? 10 years ago, we were in a completely huge big crisis in Portugal. Who would say that 10 years later we are on this position on hospitality and having visitors from all over the world?
It really has been a golden era for hospitality in Portugal. And as you mentioned, it's a country that's had a record number of visitors, and with that has to come development as well. And we'll come to some developments in a moment that your company has been doing in Lagos, in the Algarve. Just to set the scene for our international listeners, tell me a bit about the biggest challenges for that area and, being a region that is popular with tourism, is seasonality or visitor numbers an issue?
When we look to Algarve these days, we have a different picture from 10 years ago or even probably half a dozen years ago. The Algarve these days is not only the tourists and the visitors. We have an increased number as well of new residents, like digital nomads. So it is a completely different Algarve, and what that gives to the population gives a bit more stability, give a little bit more stability, for instance, on the hospitality industry, and the seasonality that you refer gave instability, for instance, for jobs, because the task force was needed in the summer and during maybe between March and I would say October. And these days it is a different picture because more and more we have a different kind of visitors. It's not only the golf, but you have a different kind of attractions. I would say that the seasonality that we used to see in Algarve, I believe that is decreasing.
Now, Broadway Malian ground has been broken there for 2 new waterfront hotels in Lagos. Tell us a bit more about, these projects and what are you hoping to achieve? What is the ambition for the area?
If I speak about these 2 particular hotels, it's quite interesting because that shows or tells the story that is happening in the whole Algarve more or less right now. So here we are in a plot that had been empty for a long, years and years, with a very good mobility because it's a plot between the marina and the train station. So it's very well served in terms of transport in the middle of city center. So, in a way, in an urban location, they are new hotels built in a very consolidated urban area around it. So in a way, it's almost like to address and to improve the quality of all that urban space. And we could create with this project a very nice public realm area around these 2 new buildings to increase the quality of the space without any doubt. And this is something that was very important for us as designers of these 2 new buildings. That is one thing. Another thing that shows what is happening in Algarve at the moment, not only in Algarve, I would say Portugal, but in Algarve specifically, is attracting the brands. When I mean the brands, I'm talking about the big brands. Traditionally, the old hospitality in Portugal, sometimes we had these family hospitality business, and these days the hospitality industry in Portugal is getting more professionalized with the enter of the brands in the market. So on these 2 new hotels, we will have a Curio by Hilton and a Gardening by Hilton, and with that, things are obviously done more professionalized, but they attract visitors and they attract namely actually a bigger number of Americans like and we are seeing an increase of American visitors in Portugal and also some Italian residents here as well. And with these brands basically gives some confidence to the visitors and to the clients because they know that the brand will give a level of quality depending then on the sub-brands. They have different targets, but at the same time, it's very interesting when we can think that we are creating new buildings in a very nice area because it's like a walking distance to the beach. And at the same time, we need to relate it with Algarve. We need to relate it with the culture. When we have the location is representing in the hotel, where, you will have a sense of arrival that when you enter in a space, you can feel that you are in Algarve. And it is very interesting and I'm very, very excited. I was on site last week and I can't wait to see those 2 hotels operating.
And it's amazing to hear, how you've been describing the project, its connection to the city, how it's integrated in the urban fabric. And not only the proximity to the waterfront and to the beach, but you mentioned as well the proximity to the train station. Now, when we were talking about this boom in the hospitality industry, not just in the Algarve, but more generally in the country, has connectivity been an issue? Are people still choosing mostly to move around by car? How is that affecting decisions about these big players, about locations for new hotels, for example? How are people moving around to enjoy Portugal?
I would say, I think trains has been more and more used, more than used to be. I personally, several times that use the train, I can see that there is an increasing number of users. So definitely together with several buses and new companies and new operators in the market. But of course, as you know, Portugal is in terms of its highways and roads, we couldn't probably more highways than we have in this country. So using the cars is easy. But Algarve You also had the airport. So I would say the country is very well served. Of course, we will have problems in the future, and there is something that is being addressed because we know, and that is an issue that is happening all over the world anyway, is water. And we as a country, and Algarve in particular, need to look very carefully and professionally to find a solution. It's not only a question of the increase for the future, is what is already happening these days, but there are solutions for that, and we need to be on board with those.
And Margarida, just finally, we've mentioned how the past decade really has been redefining for Portugal's tourism, hospitality scene, also how the country is seen as a relocation destination for many, and this influx of visitors, some more long-term than others, other really just as tourists. Just as a final question, what are your, predictions? How do you see the country evolving in the next 10 years? Do you see a continuation of this trend, or is it about supporting other less popular tourist destinations? How are you sensing the market is moving, and what are your feelings about the future direction of travel for the hospitality industry?
What is happening these days, and I see it will happen on the next 10 years, more than it happened on the past 10 years, is like brands arriving, almost like the brands arriving in Portugal. So these days, what is happening is that loads of hotels that needs to be, they are dated, they need rebrand, they need repositioning. In a way, it's much more sustainable because, as you mentioned about the location, they already exist. The construction is there. So what we can and should do more and more, and I think that it will happen a lot for this next decade, is the transformation, is the redesign and repositioning of loads of existing assets. And some are distressed, some are just dated, some are being inherited from families that these days the new generations already don't want to carry on hospitality business, and they look for these brands, and they are all coming to Portugal. Another trend that I can see, and is happening already, is like the F&B that come together with these hotels. So hotels these days, gastronomy is something that Portugal is one of the places and the destinies that Portugal haven't offered. So it means that these hotels these days bring new F&B brands, because more than ever, I think F&B is one of the things these days that is a big business as well. And that Nobu wants to come to Lisbon. He has a project. We have Six Senses already in Douro, but they also want to go to Comporta. So there is still plenty of things to do for the next 10 years. And I really would love, and really as a professional, I think we all need to be very aware that we need to do it very carefully. We need to more and more redesign and repositioning, even more than create, because using the regeneration areas to improve and link with local community. I mean, using the all best practices that we can use, things that have been tested in the world, as we have this possibility outside, that if we carry on doing that, we should be on the right track.
Margarida Caldeira, thank you very much for joining me on The Urbanist. Up next, we take in the sounds of Tokyo. What does a city sound like? Does its soundscape evolve over time, just as its architecture does? There is plenty to hear when visiting the Japanese capital, from the train melodies to the chirping birds at pedestrian crossings, the sonic chaos of Tokyo's department stores, to the omnipresent background music design not to be listened to. Alexandra Strelkova sent us this report exploring the sounds that shape the city of Tokyo.
If you've ever taken a ride on the Tokyo Metro, chances are you'll remember the contagious tunes as the trains prepare to depart. These are the Hasha melody, departure melodies first introduced by the Japan Railways in the 1970s. With the bubble economy then in full swing, its overcrowded stations were often witness to chaos and accidents. So the idea was born to design short jingles to instill a more relaxed commuting atmosphere. A few years later, it was the jazz musician Minoru Mukaya who, commissioned by the JR East Train Company, transformed the departure melodies into something of an art form. Lasting anywhere from 2 to 15 seconds and primarily featuring soft bells and synths, he composed a unique short melody for each station, more than 170 in total. Mugaya had previously gained fame as the pianist for the popular band Cassiopeia and is also a dedicated train enthusiast. Considering that nearly 7 million commuters use the Tokyo Metro every day, this technically makes him one of the most listened to musicians in the world. Over time, his tunes became something of an urban legend in itself. On the Tozai line, the snippets form an entire song in each direction if you play them together. On the Yamanote line, jingles help create a sort of sonic sense of place through a playful nod to a particular trait of each neighborhood. So, if you get off at Takadano Baba, you'll be greeted by the cheerful theme of Astro Boy, a tribute to the birthplace of the celebrated manga character. And in Ebisu Station, once home to the eponymous beer brewery, you'll hear a tune from the brand's old advertisements. Beyond the quirkiness, departure melodies form an integral part of Tokyo's soundscape. Sound is basically ubiquitous, blaring from shopping arcades, train stations, public toilets, pedestrian crossings, ramen shops, vintage clothing stores, pharmacies, and even just random spaces like streets and alleyways. A birdsong chirps alongside traffic lights to guide persons with low vision, adding to the cacophony of ambient noise and commercial announcements that spill through the public space. Whether these are delivered through loudspeakers, enthusiastic staff calling out to passers-by, or that larger-than-life 3D cat jumping off a giant LED screen in Shinjuku, the unrelenting soundscape of late capitalism is as integral to Tokyo as its gardens, shrines, or izakayas.
Nakajima Yoshimichi, a Japanese philosopher, described Japan in that way as a sound-saturated society, what's referred to as otozuke shakai in Japanese. And it really refers to the idea that I think it's particular to the cities, the major cities, and Tokyo in particular. Your everyday movements are just constantly being sort of announced and guided by sound. So whether it's these melodies on the subway platform, crosswalk jingles that are automated, political announcements that are blaring through loud, distorted loudspeakers because the volume is so intense, the sort of constant ubiquitous background music, even to the level of public restrooms where it's quite common to have white noise machines, inside the stalls. And, I think that gets at the core of this sort of almost sense of like overflow or saturation of sound.
Lorraine Plourde is the Associate Professor of Media Studies and Anthropology at Purchase College State University in New York. In her research, she focuses on how Tokyoites engage with various sonic environments within the city, and in particular, with the ubiquitous background music, or simply BGM. Turns out, no sound is an accident. What may seem like a frenetic blend of public announcements and catchy melodies is, in fact, a meticulously curated sensory landscape shaping how people live, work, and consume.
One of the things that I researched during my fieldwork was how the government was trying to kind of use sound and use music as a way to, ultimately kind of reduce stress on workers. So the company Yusen, which is really the main sort of company that provides background music for Japan, they funded an initiative, a program essentially that companies could subscribe to play background music, streaming background music in offices. And while these white-collar offices are usually not spaces that have background music, I think the idea with this was that there was a sense of increasing stress on workers and work-life balance and kind of the fears and anxieties over overworking in Japan, which has been around for many years. And there was this idea that sound or music in this way could be used to kind of manage the workers and, ultimately provide a kind of sense of healing for them as a way to kind of manage their stress and their anxiety. But again, this sort of underlying logic is the idea of ultimately making them more productive, because the implicit idea here is that if their workers are happy and calm, then they'll be more productive and more efficient. So there is a sort of insidious kind of undercurrent underlying using music as a tool in this way for productivity.
BGM is seen as a kind of low art, similar to muzak or elevator music, a practice of which the British musician and producer Brian Eno famously offered a scathing critique. Although it's been in use since the early post-war era, today, companies such as Usen operate much like a streaming service, offering subscriptions for both individuals and businesses. In retail spaces, it is carefully deployed to craft an atmosphere that subtly nudges consumers to spend more or to stay longer. While many shops and cafes rely on BGM to curate their sonic environments, its omnipresence isn't without raised eyebrows.
For the most part, it's generally tolerated. I don't think people even really see it as something necessarily dramatic or remarkable. I think it's just an important sort of facet of Tokyo's soundscapes. But I think it definitely has, can be seen as kind of a tool for manipulation on some level, especially when it's tied to commerce. You mentioned Brian Eno, and I think his ambient music manifesto gets at these questions. His notion of ambient music was diametrically opposed to how background music is being deployed in Japan and elsewhere. And his main critique was that it was Muzak, and he was specifically referencing the Muzak company. His critique was that it was just solely existing as a means to sell a product and to make people feel a certain way in a kind of very manipulative way. Whereas his notion of ambient music was about allowing the listener to kind of respond in whatever way they felt.
Beyond BGM, there's another catchy staple of Tokyo's soundscape, its distinct brand jingles. These are often inspired by, or sometimes directly borrowing from, familiar tunes ranging from American folk songs to the Beatles' Help. In fact, the latter has been cleverly repurposed as a cue to summon extra assistance for overwhelmed cashiers at a local supermarket chain. Or take Biku Camera, the electronics giant that opened its first store at the north exit to Ikebukuro Station in May 1978. Its jingle draws inspiration from the 19th century American hymn Shall We Gather at the River, and its lyrics pay homage to its home turf and the nearby Tobu and Seibu department stores. To close the ultimate imaginary soundscape loop, this March, the jingle was adopted as the official departure melody for the JR Yamanote line at Ikebukuro Station, firmly cementing its place in the city's oral identity.
I've lived in Tokyo for nearly 5 years now, and I've been visiting for a lot longer than that. And, I'm still, to this day, recording. I'm still kind of, whenever I go anywhere, I'm kind of obsessed with the soundscape of the city. And so I think for most people who aren't as otaku as me, maybe, they might just kind of just ignore these kind of background sounds. But to me, it's one of the things that makes the city so interesting and so great.
Nick Luscombe is a British DJ, music curator and broadcaster who in his work explores the intersections between sound, architecture and the urban environment. In 2010, he founded Musicity, a platform to facilitate a dialogue between architects and the city on one hand, and musicians and sound artists on the other. What started as an art project gradually evolved into an innovative platform that creates site-specific works inspired by various architectural and urban spaces. Based in Tokyo since 2020, Nick works with architects as well as developers, recording sounds of the spaces they create and suggesting ways how to improve the sonic aspects of the city. Each city has its own distinct soundscape, a peculiar collection of emblematic sounds that together weave its unique urban fabric. But why is sound so important yet so overlooked when it comes to the built environment?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, as a kind of sound obsessive, I'm always surprised that sound is still considered with very little importance, and I guess we can't help the fact that we're very, as creatures, we're quite visually inspired rather than sonically, at least on the surface. And so obviously every time you see a new development or a new building, you might see a model of it or a 3D render, but what you never do is hear anything. And I think there is a responsibility in a way when people design cities to kind of design them visually, to make them look good, obviously visually, but also to make them sound good. And I think it is overlooked. And I guess it's just a case of at the end of the day, it's probably to do with budgets. It's probably harder to convince someone with money to pay for a city that sounds good when you can just make it look good. And that's pretty much the job done. So I think it's that battle that people working in sound always have. It's just sound is always the second best, I think, to a lot of people.
Most of us rarely consider the role that sound plays in forming our perception of what constitutes a desirable living environment. When urban sound does come into focus, it's typically through the narrow lens of noise control and regulations aimed at keeping the decibels down. Sure, excess noise or sound exposure can indeed cause health issues such as increased heart rate or tinnitus. But in a fast-paced, often stressful environment, auditory cues can also guide, soothe, and reassure. I ask Nick if there is a way to improve our awareness of sounds around us.
I think it's just a case of education. I mean, what I'm doing spending a lot of my time at the moment is taking people like students, families, older people as well, into spaces and just kind of encouraging them to listen, based on the kind of Pauline Oliveros deep listening concept. And by listening to spaces, we can kind of genuinely connect to them on a better level. We can connect to communities much more through kind of the day-to-day sounds around us, or by music or spoken word or voices or dialects. It's so deep, as Pauline Oliveros would have said. But for me, it starts with that. It's kind of like educating people to listen.
So how can you listen to your favorite city? Apart from Brian Eno's ambient music and the concept of deep listening pioneered by the avant-garde composer Pauline Oliveros that Nick was mentioning, you can tune into the city live through the work of Canadian composer and writer R. Murray Schafer. After all, it was him who coined the term soundscape, a landscape made of sounds, and pioneered the art of listening to urban environments. His work laid the foundation for acoustic ecology, encouraging us to consider not just how cities look, but how they sound, and how sounds around us can reveal the character and health of a city. More recently, musician and philosopher David Rothenberg spent 5 years playing live music with nightingales in Berlin, deepening the understanding between various forms of life that inhabit the city together. Back in Tokyo, it's perhaps no wonder that riding the Yamanote line, you'll spot train buffs, YouTubers and sound artists alike, trying to catch a glimpse of the melodies before they vanish into the oblivion of Tokyo's soundscape, just moments before the next train arrives. But if you listen carefully, you can unlock another level of the city experience and even hear some unexpected Tokyo features like the ocean waves, the hum of birds and insects, or trees rustling their branches in the wind. Sounds shape cities more than we often realize. As composer John Cage once said, there is no such thing as silence. From Monocle in Tokyo, I'm Alexandra Streltsova.
And that's all for this week's episode of The Urbanist. Remember that you can get new editions of the show every week. Just follow us through your favourite podcast provider. And you can also subscribe to Monocle magazine for regular reports on all things design, architecture and urbanism. Just visit us at monocle.com. This episode of The Urbanist was produced by myself and by David Stevens, who also edits the show. Andrew Tuck will be back next week. I'm Carlotta Rebello. Goodbye, and thank you for listening, City Lovers.